including the the Juniper Prize, finalist for the National Poetry Series, runner-up for the Missouri Review Editors Prize, a Pushcart Prize, the Sherwin Howard Poetry Prize, the 2018 15 Bites Poetry Prize, the 2016 15 Bites Poetry Prize, the Nation Discovery Award, and the Book Length Poetry Award from the Utah Arts Council. So welcome, Nancy. We also have Shanan Ballam. Shanan is the current Poet Laureate of in Utah and a senior lecturer for USU's English department, where she teaches poetry writing and composition. She survived a massive stroke in January 2022, which left her without speech and without the use of the entire right side of her body. She is the author of the Red Riding Hood Papers, Pretty Marrow, Inside the Animal, the collected Red Riding Hood poems, and the forthcoming chapbook, First Poems After the Stroke. We're so happy she's doing well and she's here with us. And then our last panelist is John Belk. John is an associate professor of English at Southern Utah University, where he also directs the composition program. His poetry collection, The Gardens of Our Childhoods, was selected as one of the best new poetry books of 2023 by the New York Public Library. That is some. His chapbook, and I have to see if I can say this all in one breath. The Weathering of Igneous Rock Forms in High Altitude Riparian Environments is available from Cathexis Northwest. Welcome to all of you. I'm really excited to hear what you have to say today. Just to sort of get the conversation going. As I said, I've been really curious about persona poetry. It's not something I've done a lot in my own writing, but I feel like it's this magnificent tool that poets, when they use it well, they do work that stays with us. So I wanted to start off with a quote by Rebecca Hazelton that introduces the purpose of persona poetry really well. She says, "The desire we all have at some point in our lives to run away from ourselves isn't one we can regularly indulge, at least not without serious repercussions. But through writing and reading persona poetry, we can put on masks, or personae in Latin, and see with different eyes." And I've been thinking about how some of the best poetry collections I've read in the last few years have been all persona, and there has been a theme of specific voices that have pulled me as a reader through and introduced me to worlds I never would have entered. So I just want to start with the basic question of, for each of you, what drew you to persona in the first place, and how has it deepened or stretched your own poetry?
I can begin. I was writing poems about my sister's abusive relationship, and my mentor, Bill Trowbridge, recommended that I use a persona, and so I chose the Red Riding Hood fairy tale because it reflected my sister's abusive situation. So there was a girl, a wolf, and a grandmother, and my grandmother was really important to me, so I chose to do persona.
Well, I've written a lot of persona poems, and I'm also drawn to reading them. I just love Shanan's work, and how persona, in her case, and in many of the books that I've read lately, seem to touch on myth as well. And so they go hand in hand, I guess. And I did end up writing a chapbook called Red Voice, which is in the voice of the nymph Echo. And as far as why I wrote it, I have no idea, except I really enjoyed the myth and I felt so bad for her. I wanted to, I guess, explore what happened to her after she was banished into the wilderness, and she ends up in she lives in Utah. And so I guess, I drew on a lot of what I knew about what is here in the landscape of Utah, and also I guess I write a lot about women and freedom, and loss of freedom, and in her case, she lost her voice, and she ends up being a writer who loses her voice. So that was my interest, I guess.
I guess for me, I always shied away from persona poems for the same reason. I just always, for the same reason I shied away from fiction. Never felt like I was particularly good at creating a whole believable character. But then when I started working on Gardens, the last book, it was all about professional wrestling. And I realized these professional wrestlers, like their personas were this way that I kind of viewed myself and the way I interacted with the world. And so then I kind of embraced the persona with that book. And now the book I'm currently working on is all persona poems about pirate women. So I jumped in the deep end, I guess.
I find that really interesting because it sounds like each of you have woven together both personal experience and voice, right? That you've been able to maybe explore different elements of life, or maybe even your life, by using a different voice. So my other question is, how do you, when we use persona, or I hope teach persona to students, it should be a way to move beyond the write what you know, right? That we go deeper into something that might be a tricky place, right? Maybe uncomfortable. How do you get to the point where you feel like your persona is more than just sort of a surface kind of mimicking of a voice, that you move, whether that voice is fictional or real, right? That you move into a level of authenticity where you really inhabit the voice in a way that feels meaningful?
Well, I think, the voice carries the poem. I mean, it's a dramatic monologue, the same thing. However, I think what it teaches students, and especially advanced students, because when I think of little kids, they like to write in the voices of animals and plants. I mean, if you give them that assignment, and they have a great time with it. But as far as older students go, since it requires research in many cases, that it teaches them about how to reach audiences, how to reach an audience in poetry, so that they need to give the reader enough information, not the whole story, but enough information so that they learn what an audience needs to know and provide that material. And that teaches them something else for their own poetry, their own personal poetry, I think. How to relate to audience.
Yeah, I think the research component is super important for me. And my kind of PhD is in rhetoric, and I specialize in history of rhetoric. So by training, I'm a historian, and I love to get obsessively nerdy and just spend all my free time reading, 17th century pirate diaries and things. And like that kind of depth of research is really what kind of helps me inhabit the personas while still. And I think one of the issues that has arisen from historical persona poems is inhabiting these personas that are out of time, but still bringing them enough to the present that it connects to an audience, like Nancy was saying.
And I like to think of the quote by Aristotle, man is his desire. And so I encourage my students, whoever they are, to think about what the thing would desire. So I wrote about the grandmother's bed in Red Riding Hood, and I wrote about all afternoon the bed dreamed it was a door. And so I thought about what the bed would desire. So that's how I get my students to write about things that are below the surface.
They're great answers. Thank you so much. I'm thinking too about how persona probably pushes us. Well, poetry should push us into places where we're surprised, right? Robert Frost said, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader, right? So surprise has to be a part of our writing. But I'm wondering if persona has pushed you into places that have been particularly surprising. When I read persona poetry, I find that I tend to be more compassionate toward voices that I maybe hadn't considered before. But then many persona poems take us to places that are also really uncomfortable. One of my favorite persona poems is Skinhead by Patricia Smith. She's a Black woman writing from the perspective of a white supremacist, and it is an uncomfortable poem, but you arrive at a place where you start to see things with some compassion and a realization of how someone might arrive at that kind of worldview. So do you have a particular poem or anything that you can think of as you've done your persona poetry that has pushed you into a place where you've arrived at a new understanding of compassion or a level of discomfort that has still been important and useful?
Well, go
Sorry.
ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
So I wanted to create a round character for the wolf. And so I thought about what he would desire, because I'm very into desire. And so I wrote this poem. It's called Wolf Wears Red Riding Hood's Cape. Should I read it? Wolf wears Red Riding Hood's cape. When the story is silent behind its hard covers, Wolf slips into the cape, becomes a mind of clean wind. His clumsy paws arrange delicate shawls around grandmother's shoulders. Gently, he combs her thin hair. A wonderful sadness washes through him when he wanders in fields glistening bluebells, their heads bowed in reverence. He hears their soft prayers. For hours, he labors with a paintbrush, watercolors, paints sunsets for grandmother, orange, purple, gold. She fastens his pictures high on her walls. He floats in a cold river, opens his eyes underwater, feels the pure ecstasy of distortion. He sleeps next to grandmother. In the dark, she tells him of baby Moses, adrift in his tiny ark. So I imagined that the wolf wouldn't want to be just a predator. I think that I imagined that he would desire tenderness. And so that gained me a greater compassion for the wolf, because as Joseph Campbell said, whether you call someone a hero or a monster is all relative to where the focus of your consciousness is. So I just really had to delve deep into my own mind and determine what and create a round character for the wolf. And that's how I did it.
Yeah.
Being really interesting. I was just going to say, when I wrote the book Red Voice, yeah, I do have it here. Since I made her a writer, and also a river runner at the beginning, before, well, she has kind of lost her voice and realizes it, but hasn't accepted it yet. I thought of how words, when they're so very important to writers, I mean, that's your lifeblood. And if you lose your words, and then I thought, well, she didn't really lose her words. She still has them. She just can't say them unless she repeats what someone else says, which too is sad. But anyway, if you decide you ever want to read the book, I won't give you the spoiler about, it is contemporary. It is a contemporary view of a woman. So I'll read one poem from that book. And this is the beginning poem called Echo the River Guide. When I spoke words, they were awnings of balsam, bathing the woods in a psychedelic show. They were the apple orchard melting like the bleat of wild orchid, the staccato raz of squirrels. They were simple, carried out to the point of rapture, dropping seeds to plant on the fig of my tongue. I was the chord of the chrysalis, the pupa and the wings. I was the swarm humming in the deepest well. The words swirled like petals in a dark pool, spinning to a tiny coast of fool's gold. I needed a voice, and the voice was there, never telling on the bear. There were rolls of words, lifesavers splitting out of their silver. There were words that roared like rapids, stung like nettles, scenting the air with acres of sage. They were fluorescent tents in a meadow, sleeping bags like Crayola cocoons. They were pistachios and laughter, a Ouija board and eerie hums from us. They were the orders I brayed when the raft headed for the skull hole. My crew paddling in unison to ride its lip in amethyst shadow. They were the wild charts I sang to cross the shallow reef when I took the kayak out alone.
I love that poem.
Thank you.
Nancy, it's beautiful.
I have a kind of different answer to this question, I guess, but it still leads to the poem that I brought to share. So as far as the kind of discomfort that can happen with persona poetry, what I found was that persona poetry helped me kind of write about things that were really uncomfortable, or I don't know, it gave me a bit of a buffer for things that were just emotionally too much for me. And so in that sense, it was kind of good, like things that I, especially contemporary issues that I couldn't quite find the words or the right way to approach, the persona poems kind of gave me that way to do that, and in a sense kind of closed that historical gap too. And so, like I said, that issue of timeliness is something that kind of came up as I was writing all these persona poems. How do I take something from the 16th century and make it fresh contemporarily? And so the poem that I'm going to share it came out in Menagerie magazine, which is a nice Utah literary magazine that you should all check out. But this is a poem called For Elijah, and it was actually a poem written. It's a persona poem from this fictional pirate queen narrator from the collection. But the poem itself was in response to the death of Elijah McClain, who was a young neurodivergent man who was killed by police in Aurora, Colorado, a few years ago. And it was just one of those moments that was so kind of gut wrenching and emotional for me. I didn't have the words to write like a today poem about it. And so this persona poem, oddly enough, gave me a way into it. So I'll share it really quick. It's called For Elijah. The brutality of it was stunning. There was no sound, really, nothing but a dizzy whistle of rope, like starlight filtered through spring. He made no sound as the line caught and dragged him beneath the hull. I expected something. A scream? I had never seen a man die. His body left pieces of flesh up the side of the ship as we hauled it to deck. He was called Elijah, like the prophet. In his sea chest was a violin and a cloth embroidered with wildflowers, yellow rattle, cowslip, some type of ranunculus. I do not know if he bled to death before drowning, but I expected a chariot of fire, a whirlwind, the very hand of God to reach down and cradle this child we left there, unrecognizable, face turned to the sun. I learned that day that God speaks not in the doings of men. Her silence is our punishment forever. A mother's touch out of reach, a ghost of something we broke, a truth that we were all damned from the beginning.
Thank you, John. we've all gone somewhere uncomfortable, right? I think all those poems pushed us into an unusual place. I really like John's comment specifically about being able to say hard things or face hard things that maybe you personally can't, right? The mask is kind of a buffer, right? I think that was the word you used,
Yeah.
that you're able to go some wild, strange, hard places that maybe our consciousness does not let us go, right? So are there ways that help you access that? I mean, I imagine that right, with acting or with putting on a mask, it takes some time to get there. You guys have mentioned research specifically, but does it take you a while to get in that voice? Or what are your strategies for entering a place where you can get to saying those difficult things? It sounds like you have all had a process to do that, and many of that, or much of that, has come from writing multiple poems and in a certain persona. So how have you been able to access that? And do you feel like persona specifically has taken you to maybe wilder places of your imagination and how that's happened?
Yeah. Well, in a sense, the book I wrote called The Worrier, which is in two voices, and they are kind of persona poems, I guess, because there was a questioner and an answerer, and as I was writing them, I wasn't really thinking of myself necessarily. I was just, well, the initial poem was called The Woman I Always Wanted to Be. It wasn't even called The Worrier. And that started this collection, I guess. So it was just an exciting thing for me to try to do at that point, because I had never written those kinds of, a call and response or question and answer types of poetry. And so I guess the form and the voices took me places where I never thought I would ever go.
Your warrior poems remind me of almost a splitting of the self asking hard things and the other part of the self answering hard answers. So yeah, I think that's definitely one that seems persona.
And I'm very interested in metamorphosis. So I imagined what the basket would have been, Red Riding Hood's basket. And I imagined that it would have been a wonderful willow, and it was just turned into a basket that was nothing more than a place for women to stuff bread and wine. And so, I thought about how it would feel to be a basket. And eventually the wolf comes by and sniffs around Red Riding Hood, and he goes to scream out, "Run," but he has no tongue. So that's how the poem ends. And so that's where I am very interested in metamorphosis. So that's what I concentrate on. So all of my poems have something to do with metamorphosis.
I can't really point to anything definite in my process, but there are definitely times where I can kind of get inside her head, the narrator's head, and like the poems will just come and I'll get like 3 or 4 in a week. And then there are some times where it's just like I just can't quite get there. Just it sounds like me pretending. And so I don't really I don't know, I just take it when I can get it, I guess. One thing that has helped though is I play Dungeons and Dragons, and this sounds really silly, but just role playing a character helps with that. Like thinking about a character's motives that aren't my motives, and like what would that character do, and how would they behave differently. Uh, it's a fun. I mean, it's fun, but it's also a kind of interesting exercise in creating personas. So
I love that. Each of your answers has suggested that persona helps us explore the complexity of human experience, right? Even if that human experience bleeds over into things that are less animate, right? Or less sentient, like Shannon's talking about, or splitting the self a little bit, or going into voices that liberate a part of us. I think that's really exciting. I feel like poetry has more in common with theater than we often admit. And persona poetry really opens the door to that, and I find really exciting. We have a question in the Q&A from Michael Souter that I'll read, and then we'll pop back into maybe a couple more questions that I have, or any extra comments you guys have, and round it off in a little bit. The question from Michael Souter says, I wonder if any of you have written persona poems in the voice of a real person, perhaps a historical figure. And I wonder what you might think about doing that. Seems like that would be really intimidating, right? I once served on an MFA committee of a collection of poems in the voice of a Spanish conquistador. Is writing in the voice of an actual person something you might consider doing?
Yeah, I have a poem in the voice of a nun who lives in 16th century Italy in an abbey. And I felt like you did at first, John, with, like, why am I writing this? And do I have, I mean, where's this coming from? And but I enjoyed looking up some details, and then the rest, created what she might have felt. And she was forced into this abbey. So many of the women at that time went into an abbey because they thought they would get a really good education, and it was looked upon as a happy place. But not everyone felt that way. And of course, all abbeys were different. But so, yeah, I did try that, Michael. I'm still working on it.
I've tried it too. So the kind of two central sequences of this pirate book that I'm working on. The first is a narrative sequence of poems in the persona of this fictional narrator, and then the other sequence is persona poems in the personas of these actual historical pirate women. So what's fun about that is while the fictional narrative sequence is kind of set in the 16th, 17th century, these other poems let me go all over the world and all throughout history. And yeah, I've just been they're a lot harder to write. Writing from an actual person persona rather than my fictional narrator's persona has definitely, they're the harder poems of the manuscript for sure.
And I have written in the voice of my own grandmother. I imagined the Red Riding Hood's grandmother to be my grandmother. And so that poses a lot of difficulties because I just have to imagine what she would have thought. And I imagine that she would have, because she was LDS, but she was very unhappy in her marriage. And so I imagined that she would be thinking that she would like to leave the church. And so that's what I did, but I don't know if that's fair.
I was wondering, I was just, as we were talking, is there any place that you would not go and take on a persona that you might feel you don't have the right to write in the voice of that person? I've heard a lot of people say, no, you should just write, in that voice if you want to. But I feel that there are sometimes, lines that get crossed or could be crossed. And so I was just curious what you thought.
Well, I wouldn't want to write in the voice of a Black man, for instance, because I don't have any experience being a Black man.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd feel very uncomfortable trying to do that. And there are other people that I would just feel really uncomfortable putting my voice into their mouth.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
I agree too. Yeah. And I think that even when I am writing in a persona that I feel comfortable writing in, it requires an immense amount of sensitivity. And I'm still not always perfect about it, but I think just paying attention to the kind of lenses that I'm approaching things through. And
Mhm.
but no, I agree. There are certainly lines where I mean, just things that, what am I going to say? Right? Like something that's so far out of my life experience that I'm not sure that even a fictionalized persona approach would help me enter it.
That's perfect. That was something I was going to ask is, of course, we want to have authenticity, but recognizing that there may be some places where we are less comfortable, right? We don't feel like we would do it service. We have another question about someone who's asking, this is MJ Barnes, if we'd like to try writing from a persona, how would you suggest we start? I wonder if sometimes students need to be given that specific permission to go way outside of their wheelhouse, right? And their natural voice. So do you have any suggestions or any prompts that you give to students or to writers to sort of help them start to put on a mask and play with persona?
Yeah, I have a exercise called The Widow by Mara Stanton, and it's write a poem in the voice of a widow whose husband has drowned. Invent any story you'd like. And this works because it helps students practice empathy. And the specificity of the exercise gets students to express emotion through concrete detail and imagery. So, and then I do another exercise where I have them read my poem, Grandmother's Bed, and then we brainstorm a list of inanimate objects and common stories. And then because common stories, you can use the connotations from the common story. So you don't have to create a story from scratch. And then I have them write in the voice of an inanimate object using the template of my poem, which starts all afternoon the bed dreamed it wasn't. So to imagine what the object would desire.
Wow. I often use I have an exercise on myth, and so that's a good one to talk about a particular myth or a few myths in class, and bring some examples of how people have written in the voices. Also, we have Danielle Dabrowski, my husband Jan Minnick, who writes in the voices of women, and actually women pirates, John. And well, he has a few anyway, not a whole series, but so I think writing, some people also channel voices. They feel very, very close to figures. And I'm sure you're getting that way with your series, John. But I like that idea of mythology. Also, you could take students to a museum after talking about persona poems, and then have them, whether it's an art museum or another kind of museum that's natural history or whatever, and see what they're inspired by, and then take them back to the classroom and talk about that.
I so I think that persona poems kind of the best persona poems can kind of stem from obsession and a kind of creepy voyeurism almost. And so I kind of lean into that with students. If you're at a university, your university's library probably has a special collections, and that special collections probably has personal correspondence from certain people. And so they can look through boxes of somebody's personal correspondence. You can also just get like just like collected, like Elizabeth Bishop and Robert Lowell's published letters, right? And just let students read 10, 12 personal letters and start to get into, I mean, then they really get to see behind the scenes of a persona, right? And there's that kind of element of excitement. It's almost voyeuristic, like reading this person's private letters. And that's when you can really start to inhabit, like, what motivated them? Why did they make decisions the way they did? So I do that, either go to special collections or get just a collected published edition of personal correspondence and start reading.
I love those. Those are all terrific suggestions. Well, we have about 6 minutes left. I think we've answered the questions, but my final question for you is to round this off. Do you have any specific poetry collections or poems that you feel like are exemplary of persona and that might be a good introduction to someone, or particularly good examples?
Louise Gluck, The Wild Iris.
Mhm.
I love that one because we can write, you said plants, right? From the perspective of a
Yeah.
plant, this beautiful life that a plant can have.
John Berryman's The Dream Songs.
Yeah. There's a really wonderful collection called Kettle Bottom by Diane Gilliam Fisher. And it's about a West Virginia coal mine revolt, basically. And so it's persona poem from all of the people that lived in this mine town. So the children, the older people, the mine workers, the wives, like everybody. And it kind of tells the larger story of this mine collapse and then a subsequent revolt by the workers. And so it's fantastic, and it adopts just a breadth, like just a really broad diversity of perspectives. Kettle Bottom by Diane Gilliam Fisher.
Nancy, do you have any you'd suggest?
Books, gosh, I can't think offhand. I mentioned Danielle Dabrowski from Cedar City, who has not her latest book, but the previous one, and I can't think of the title right now. Ruin and Light. That's great.
Lucille Clifton writes in the voices of Adam and Eve, and Marie Howe writes in the voice of Magdalene.
It looks like Kimberly Johnson said on here, Menagerie is co-edited by a Utah poet, Kristen Eliason. Yeah, just collections. I think it's so cool to be able to show students and to remind ourselves, right, different voices that we can step into. Okay, 3 minutes left. So my very last question. What do you feel like, we kind of already stepped into this for a second, but what are some of the biggest challenges of writing in persona for you? You talked for a minute about voices that you wouldn't feel comfortable doing, but are there any pitfalls to be aware of as you start teaching persona with students, or anything to be aware of that you need to tackle that you've wrestled with specifically with persona poetry?
Well, readers might already think that they know about the characters and they might not want to read the story, read your poems. So that's one drawback.
I don't know if it's a drawback, but it certainly stretches your own identity. It makes you kind of think about who you are and kind of where your fuzzy boundaries of self are. And that can be challenging, but it can also be really, really good. So
yeah, I agree. It's very freeing.
Thank you so much. Appreciate all of your wonderful comments and your suggestions. And just thank you again for being here and for your beautiful work and sharing your specific poems. Thank you.
Thank you.
I also want to thank Sunni for moderating this panel and for coming up with this idea, and for Nancy, John, and Shanan for being on the panel today. I think it's been such a rich discussion with so many resources. Thank you so much. I hope that you will show up for our next session, which is about poetry and music and sound, which will be moderated by John Belk and feature a lot of really interesting folks on that panel. Thank you again, and and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks. Thanks so much. Bye-bye. Good to see y'all.
Good to see you too.